I am having what I think is going to be a very powerful conversation today with oncologist, author, Dr. Raza. Thank you so much for joining me in this conversation today. You mentioned prior to me recording this that our hearts are both in the right place in this kind of together. You losing your husband, Harvey, and my mother passing away as recently as last month. And so I am excited for this conversation, hopeful and optimistic for this conversation as well. So Dr. Raza, thank you so much for sitting down virtually with me today. We're going to jump right in. I want to know, in your words, what's your history? Why, where are you from? Tell me about, why cancer? How did you get here? How did you get where you are today?
Erlina, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. And to the audience, I would like to say that what Erlina said is really true about our hearts being connected through a loss of a loved one to this dreaded scourge, cancer. And anyone listening to the program, we are all literally at most 1 degree separated from cancer nowadays. And I am feeling so honored to be on this podcast. I would like to offer my deepest sympathies to Erlina and your siblings for the loss of such a grand personality that at least your mother appears to be, from everything that I'm reading about her and about the children that she nurtured and gave them the right values. What could make a mother prouder than that? So
thank you. Thank you.
It's an honor to be here for me. And thank you for asking me about my background. So it's very an odd kind of situation. I was born and raised in Karachi, Pakistan. But from the very earliest memories I have, I was very curious about nature. And as a 4-year-old, I remember being scolded by my mother because I would be following ants around on my knees. And I was so fascinated and very, very interested in nature. But Erlina, in Pakistan, growing up, our entry into science wasn't easy because we did not have advanced education in science available. And the only way to get into science for men and women was really to enter medical school or engineering, one of the two. So I decided to go to med school thinking that as soon as I finished my training, I'm going to go over to the West and take admission in a graduate studies program doing molecular biology or marine biology or paleoanthropology, any one of those things. And I was reading in all these areas constantly. But then, as a third-year medical student, Erlina, I met my first patient. And one look was all it took. Because suddenly my curiosity changed to wonder. Curiosity is when you are looking for explanations that makes things clear to you. But wonder is just the opposite. You think you know something, but suddenly something strikes you and turns everything on its head. And seeing patients did that to me. And then seeing cancer patients in Pakistan, when they show up traveling hundreds of miles from remote villages, carrying huge, massive tumors, fungating masses at end-stage disease, in skeletal, frail bodies literally attached to huge tumors. You never see that kind of thing in the West because we treat very early. But you see the end-stage ravages of cancer in those parts of the world. And so when you ask me, how did I reach this point? I loved science. I entered medicine because I wanted to be a scientist, but then I realized that once I met my first patient, everything I do in my life would be informed by trying to help the suffering of these patients. And cancer presented not just an intellectual challenge because of its malice, the kind of aggressive nature of this disease, how is that a normal cell has gone rogue to such an extent to produce such a horrible tumor? And then an emotional connection as well, as the intense suffering of humanity can incite in you. So this was the intellectual and emotional challenge that gripped me in my late teens, and I have never looked back.
I've never looked back. You received your calling early, and on the journey you went. What causes cancer? Where does it come from? How do we get it?
Yes. It's a real enigma inside a mystery, inside a secret. We know that. It's very enigmatic. Nobody really knows for sure in every case, but here are the four possibilities. Number one, we think that there is a genetic susceptibility to getting cancer. So it runs in families, some of them definitely. The second is that exposure to toxins can damage some of our stem cells and cause cancer. We know that for certain also. For example, benzene can cause leukemia. We know the connections. A third possibility is pathogens, which means bacteria, viruses, fungi can all cause cancer. We know stomach cancer being caused by Helicobacter pylori. We know that liver cancer can be caused by hepatitis B and C viruses. We know some bladder cancer that can be caused by parasites, so pathogen. But Erlina, the problem is that together, the genetic predisposition, the having BRCA, one or two genes, etc., or having exposure, or having a pathogen, these account for less than 30% of the total cancers. So where are the other 70% coming from? Nobody really knows, but the idea is that as the cell divides into two cells, it has to double its DNA. And during the doubling of DNA, during the copying of these 3 billion base pairs, it can make mistakes. That mistake is called mutation. So as the number of cells keep dividing, the mistakes can accumulate. If they are bad enough, then the cell either corrects the mistake or commits suicide for the better good of the group. The individual cell will force itself to go out of existence, or it will fix the problem. But if the mistake is not anywhere in a vital gene, then it will remain in the cell. So each cell division can lead to 1 to 3 DNA errors that get carried to the next generation. By the time we are 50 years old, that means we have lots of cells which have accumulated lots of mutations. So think of it like if you start dropping grains of sand, it will form a pile. But then with eventually one grain of sand, the pile will collapse suddenly. Now, this last grain of sand that caused the avalanche was no different than the thousands of grains of sand that came before it. What had happened was that the pile had become unstable, so that even one grain of sand could cause it to collapse now. So with age, our body becomes unstable. In that we have more mutations in every cell now that have accumulated over the years. We have an immune system that's become a little decrepit. We have more and more cells which are aged, and we call them senescent. They're not serving any useful function, but producing all the garbage that cells produce in the process of metabolism. And all this poisons the environment a bit. So for all these reasons, we think that cancer is a consequence of the damage caused to the body and the instability caused to the body by aging. Is it just mutations? Absolutely not, Erlina. Is it just the immune system? No. We don't know the exact cause, but like the last grain of sand wasn't very different than the rest of the grains of sand. But it's somehow the last straw that causes the collapse. Think of it something like that.
Yeah. Such a good point. When I think about aging, I want you to talk a little bit about the book that you wrote, because in it you talk about your husband. You talk about your husband Harvey and how he had it in his 30s and then again. And I'm sure there's a connection there. You mentioned it, but tell a little bit of the story of course, your husband and then Andrew's story.
So Andrew, about 4 years ago, suddenly presented with weakness in his arm. He's taken to the emergency room and he was quadriplegic within hours. The surgeons, when they operated on his brain, could only remove 90% of a 9-centimeter large brain tumor that was sitting there. Every single treating oncologist knew from that moment on that nothing we do now is going to improve the survival of Andrew. But what followed was tons of chemotherapy, radiation therapy, radical surgeries, placement of a shunt, immune therapy, more chemo, more surgeries, constant tortures. And 16 months later, Andrew died. How we failed Andrew. You know how old he was? 22 years old when he was diagnosed and 23 when he died. And for me, it's a very personal story because Andrew was my daughter Scheherazad's best friend. He wasn't her boyfriend because Andrew was gay. And you know, when he was first told about his diagnosis, this young man, so beautiful, coming in and out of my house since he's 15 years old. Throughout high school and college, these kids took their vacations together, going to Paris or London, Amsterdam. He spent his last undergrad year in Paris, training as a fashion designer, finished his studies, comes back to New York, gets diagnosed with brain tumor and dies within 16 months. Such a tormented death, I can't tell you. The toll that cancer took on this poor boy in terms of his paralysis of limbs and the severe headaches, the projectile vomiting, the kinds of the surgeries that caused intense pain to him constantly. So it wasn't as if he was just dying of cancer, but also of the treatment constantly. And the question, the choices, this is what I wanted to get to your audience, not to scare people, but to think about this, that when this young man was first told about his diagnosis of brain cancer, do you know what he did? He so confidently and with such a smile, he turned to his mother and he said, "Mom, don't worry, just call Azra. She's on the cutting edge. She's going to find the cure for me." This is what slapped me in my face physically. On the one hand, the aggressiveness of his tumor. On the other hand, the utter helplessness of all of us to do anything to help this young man. And why did this happen? Because of what you said, Arlena, the delay in diagnosis. Why did this cancer become a 9-centimeter monstrosity, filling half his head? Why? Before we could he even developed symptoms, because cancer is a silent killer. Yes, it happens in young people, but of course, much less than in older people. So
No, I want to dig into that a little bit more, is because Andrew has this 9-centimeter tumor, and you said something that was so important. The doctors, the oncologists knew what his prognosis would be. We were, my family and I, my siblings and I, just to give a little context, my mother was diagnosed, at the time of her diagnosis, she was diagnosed with stage 3B inflammatory breast cancer. And by that time, it was not only in her breast, but her lymph nodes, and she had to have a thoracentesis because she was having fluid buildup in the chest wall. So we knew it had spread. We knew it had metastasized. But at that point, watching that information be delivered to my mom, the patient is only faced with one choice. What other choice for people like my mom and Andrew do they have other than to fight, even knowing the prognosis? And how can our system, our medical system, our oncologists like yourself better tool or better equip someone in that position? Is our system good at giving those choices confidently in those moments?
Yeah. You're raising some very serious fundamental issues that all of us deal with all the time. Because what are the choices for someone like your mother or for Andrew? We know that they have end-stage disease. So the choice is either we say, okay, go and enjoy whatever time is left to you and don't take any treatment, because taking treatment or not taking treatment, you will be dead within this 2-year period anyway. But then if we don't treat, what will happen? The cancer will become so much worse, and death from cancer is one of the most painful deaths possible. So that's why, in a way, we keep giving palliative care to try and reduce the pain. We try to control the aggression of the cancer. How does cancer kill? Cancer doesn't kill. What kills the patient is either starvation because they can't eat anymore, or infection, or bleeding. Those are the 3 most common causes of death from cancer. Or, you know, so it really, it's a very difficult question what kind of choice we should have given. For example, Andrew was only 22 years old. How do you tell the mother of a 22-year-old? How do you tell a 22-year-old that at most you have, I mean, the survival rate is 3% patients are alive at 18 months. He can go Google it and see it. Does he want to know it? And how sure are we, and what is our responsibility? In a way, the younger oncologists, Arlena, at this point, driven by the vigor of youth, cannot accept it themselves, that they are so helpless. And they will try to do their best, as you said, to follow the American way, which is a little aggressive. However, in a way, this is what makes us realize the difference between cure and healing. There's a big difference. Cure is something that is offered for a disease, but healing comes for the entire illness. And what I want to stress here is that when you know for sure that you can't offer a cure, then the doctor's real journey and real challenge begins to try and heal the spirit of the patient by providing a modicum of some relief. Hope is usually the subject of all our actions. We look forward to, okay, there is hope, let's try to get to that point. But if there is no hope, then in a way, Arlena, the hopelessness itself becomes the subject of action. Because when you cannot look forward to next year, then you better pay attention to the here and now. And in a way, that brings relief to patients to enjoy whatever they have. So in the final analysis, the only consolation is that there is no consolation. The only answer is that there is no easy answer. How to break this news? What should we do? Should we treat, or should we let the patients just have? The reason I wrote the book, I have been saying the same thing over and over. Since 1903, it has been known that it's not cancer that kills, but the delay in treatment that kills. So early detection is the only way to cure this disease. Even though we are still curing it with slash, poison, and burn, at least we cure it in 68% patients who are diagnosed early. The 40%, like your mother or Andrew, who are diagnosed late, then for them, the outcome is no different than it was in 1930. So in 100 years, we have not done much. The question then comes up, if we are not able to help them with advanced disease, shouldn't we be spending less on trying to treat end-stage diseases and more, for the future at least, on trying to develop the better techniques to diagnose not early cancer, even the earliest footprint of cancer. In a way, we should be monitoring healthy bodies to find the transition towards illness. Even before the first cell becomes a bona fide clinical entity of a tumor, we should be able to pick up the perturbations years in advance leading to it and correct it there. In other words, monitoring wellness to preempt illness. And I promise you, the coming decade of 2020 to 2030, this is the decade where we are going to make the switch from treating diseases to preventing diseases, from being reactive to being proactive, from trying to treat end stage to preventing even the earliest stage.
When we look at something like a pancreatic cancer, or we look at even cervical cancer, I believe that both of those cancers are found at their later stages. Why aren't we better in the last 50 years at solving the advanced stage cancer problem?
Well, that's easy, because cancer is very complicated, and each time the cell divides, it becomes more complicated. And they're dividing so fast that even if I take a tumor from me and try to grow it in the lab and find a drug that is effective against it, by the time I bring it back, the cancer has moved on. It is now not the same cancer that it was 6 weeks ago when I took it out. So when I bring the treatment, I am treating something that existed 6 months ago. So it's very complicated to treat advanced disease. That's it. It is much easier to try and find and prevent the disease. You know, I started in 1977 when I came to this country by studying and treating a deadly kind of bone marrow cancer, acute myeloid leukemia. Very soon it became obvious to me that in my lifetime, this disease will not be cured. It is so vicious and so aggressive. So some of my patients were giving stories of, oh, our counts were low for months before we were diagnosed with leukemia. And that stage is called pre-leukemia. So as a young person, it occurred to me then that, well, we should be treating these patients at the early stage of pre-leukemia, intercepting before the disease even becomes leukemia. So by 1984, I had turned my focus to studying pre-leukemia, which is called myelodysplastic syndromes, and following these patients longitudinally as they progressed in this trajectory of the natural history of their illness from pre-leukemia to acute leukemia. Now, had I gone to school in this country by now, Erlina, I would have then, next thing I would have done is to try and make an animal model of the disease. But I was a naive young person who had just arrived from Pakistan. So instead of custom and tradition, I depended on my instinct. And my instinct told me that if I'm going to study this disease, I need cells. So I just started putting bone marrow and blood cells into the freezers and saving samples on my patients. I started this in 1984. Today, I have more than 60,000 samples on thousands of patients with pre-leukemia as their disease marches and progresses and kills them. And many are still alive many years later also. Of these 60,000 samples, not a single cell comes from a second oncologist. I have taken care of all the patients. I draw their bloods to this day. I do the bone marrows with my own hands. And it is so humbling. I can't remember any patient besides maybe 1 or 2 in these 40 plus years who said no to me, to giving their samples for research. Out of these 60,000 samples, every vial and every tube has a poignant story for me. Every name means something to me. It's a very precious tissue repository. And what we need to do is we need to use the latest technology, looking at genomics, proteomics, transcriptomics, metabolomics, the microbiome. I have everything. We need to look at the longitudinal samples very carefully, trace the disease back from acute leukemia to its very inception, and then ask the question, why did some healthy person even get pre-leukemia? What was making them susceptible to it? It can all be done, but where is the will? Where is the will? How many times have I written to the federal agencies, to the director of all the centers saying, I have all this tissue. I raise $1 million a year just to support the tissue repository.
Mm-hmm.
We need to invest in studying these kinds of samples. And this pandemic, Erlina, brought a kind of boom for me, because as soon as we went into lockdown, guess what I got introduced to? Zoom. And Zooming means you can be connected to the world.
Right,
Before,
exactly.
the scientists and oncologists were too busy traveling from meeting to meeting. Now suddenly they're homebound. So I put together what I'm calling the oncology think tank, TOT.
Right.
I put together 30 of the top leaders in the country from academia and industry. Johns Hopkins, MD Anderson, Dana-Farber, University of Chicago, Northwestern, all kinds of great universities, plus some top leaders from industry who are doing the best work in early detection. You know what we did? Every week, we met for 2 hours every single week. We have now completed 17 meetings. I realized, Erlina, that I have written a book. I keep talking about early detection and monitoring wellness to find illness, but I'm a lone voice.
Mm-hmm.
Building a consensus will really bring strength to it, because people can ignore me as a single voice, but how do you ignore 30 of the top names in the country who are saying the same thing? So we have now written an opinion paper, and you must interview me after this comes out. We are just about to submit it next week. The opinion paper says exactly this, that the future of cancer research and treatment is prevention through early detection.
Mm-hmm.
We should be putting, yes, we have patients today, we have to take care of them. So half our resources should go to trying to make life as tolerable, as painless, and as compassionately helpful as possible for them.
Yeah.
But then for the future, let us imagine a better option. Let us not subject people to slash, poison, burn. Let's do it so early that a little zapping with a laser beam would just remove the cancer from their bodies without having to suffer consequences. So now the whole think tank has come up with this idea. It will be very hard to ignore.
What you're doing makes so much sense to me. Investing in it, listening to what it is that you have to say makes so much sense to me. Why is there so much hesitation? Why is there so much pushback?
I wouldn't say there is a pushback directly, Erlina. It's just the idea is that every one of us has been trying to improve the outcome for patients. And each of us is invested many, many years in one area. And it's very hard to give up what you're doing. You know, there's a very nice saying, if I asked my customers what they want, they would have said a faster horse. Who said this? Henry Ford. You know, so people couldn't even imagine a car. So if you ask them, you know, way back, what would be the best thing for you in terms of transportation, they would have said a faster horse.
Yeah.
But somebody imagined a better thing. It's just the same as once you have a word processor, who remembers the typewriter? No one. But while the typewriter is there, or while the horse is there, you keep trying to improve that. And that's what we've all been trying to do in our little silos. And there was a lot of hope, really, that once the human genome will be sequenced, we will find the mutations, we'll be able to fix them. So it isn't like we have been sitting lazy or not working or not imagining things, but each of those things that we had so much hope with came crashing down. For a time, we thought we just have to block off the blood supply, and choking off the blood supply will cure the cancer, and it didn't. So these things took their time. I think that now it is very clear that all the things we had such high hopes with have not proved to be very effective, and that in the final analysis, it seems that end-stage cancer is just a very difficult, moving, constantly shifting, evolving, metamorphosing kind of disease that is impossible to control. So more and more people are coming over towards the idea of earlier detection. But in the meantime, there is so much money to be made in the drug development area that it's not that they're doing it deliberately.
Hmm.
Industry's whole idea and their stated purpose is to make money. Of course it is. But the way our cancer research system works is so distorted that I make an insight in my lab. Now, to take this insight to the bedside, I can't do it myself because it's going to cost $150 million to do the phase 1 trial. It's so expensive. The only people who can do it is industry. So I have to partner with industry, and industry's stated purpose is to make money for their shareholders. So they are being faithful to what their stated purpose is. It's just the whole system that has become so unsupportable now. This is the problem.
And as you mentioned, it is changing. We are hopefully, due to this period, this kind of timeout, it is changing. It is evolving. We are having different conversations because we cannot afford to continue as we have been.
You mentioned pancreatic cancer earlier, that a lot of people are diagnosed late. Let me give you just a flash into the future about pancreatic cancer. For example, as pancreatic ductal adenocarcinoma forms, the duct connects the pancreatic tumor to the gut, and the pathogens, bacteria, migrate through the duct into the pancreatic cancer. Mm-hmm. When any kind of microorganism or pathogen goes, immune cells also arrive. So now you have the tumor cells, you have the bacteria from the gut which have arrived and now are causing the tumor microbiome, and you have lots of immune cells. Why aren't the immune cells killing the tumor cells? It turns out that the pathogens, the bacteria are helping the tumor cells flash a signal on their surface saying, don't eat me, don't eat me, don't eat me. So they keep the immune cells away. Well, then scientists simply injected antibiotics into the tumor. Antibiotics went in and killed the bacteria. So now that flashing signal of don't eat me disappeared, and the same immune cells sitting there ate up the tumor. So then the scientists said, well, we can't inject antibiotics into the pancreas. So now you know how they are treating pancreatic cancer in already done fecal transplant. Just give the right bacteria to migrate into the gut, which don't force the cell. So this is the kind of future treatment coming from an understanding of the gut microbiome. Imagine that we have 37 trillion cells in our body, but we have 4 times that much bacteria, viruses, and fungi living in our system. So these things are doing crazy things, and it's impossible to recommend one diet which is universally applicable to all. In fact, the future of all of medicine is that each of us, you and me, will be surrounded by billions of data points in our iClouds, and Fitbits will be monitoring all kinds of information on us. Everything being fed and then recorded into, we can download onto our cell phones, and it will tell us that today I took antibiotics, my microbiome has changed. So for me, for the next 2 weeks until my pathogens are replenished back to the healthy state, I shouldn't be eating carrots, or I shouldn't be eating eggs, or I should be eating that. So in the future, precision medicine will be individualized according to each person's needs, tailored to their needs, but based on artificial intelligence, constantly machine learning through billions of data points that are collected on everybody. This is the kind of medicine we are moving towards. And that is why it is not possible for me to recommend a preventive diet very simply.
Gotcha. Yeah. Very good. Very good. You know, hearing you now, so much optimism, so much awareness on the future of where we're going. And I almost can take like this deep breath hearing you speak today. So many people, it costs so many people their lives for us to get to where we're going. My mother, your husband. And so I would like to get to a place where I join you in that optimism. Today, you know, is today. So we'll see. Let's talk about the future of your tissue repository. Let's talk about the future, what you were working on at this time. I love the think tank. Again, a brilliant idea for where we are today and where we can go. But let's talk about the future. What is the future? What is next for you with the tissue repository and with this think tank group?
Fantastic. This will be a great way for us to end. So listen, I had this brilliant idea actually in 1996, even if I say so myself, because it's so, it's not brilliant in the sense of IQ brilliance, but just seeing the facts as for what they are.
Yeah.
And I, again, don't want to scare any of your listeners or the audience, but I'm going to quote one statistic that I realized back in 1996, which is that we need to study people who are at high risk of developing cancer, right? If we start monitoring them, if they are at high risk, we know that they are going to develop cancer, or some of them will definitely. Then we can find the footprints rather than looking at 300 million healthy people. Who are the people who are at high risk? Again, don't be scared, but people who have had one cancer are at high risk of getting another. My own husband is the best example. Harvey was born and raised in Brooklyn. At 34 years of age, he got his first cancer, which he survived. Brutal treatments. Then at 57, he got a completely unrelated second cancer from which he died. So one reason is that whatever allowed the first cancer to appear in a body, the same body is still there. So there is a chance that a second cancer can appear. But also, additionally, the kinds of treatments we give our patients also damage their healthy cells and make them susceptible to get another cancer. So the idea I had was, why we have a lot of cancer survivors. In fact, today in 2020, 16 million cancer survivors in this country. By 2030, there will be 26 million cancer survivors. MD Anderson sees 80,000 cancer survivors a year. At Columbia University, we are following 1,000 women with breast cancer who have survived cancer, but now are at risk maybe of, I'm not saying they're all at risk, please don't get me wrong, but 1 in 5 new cancers appear in a cancer survivor. So the incidence for individuals is less than 1 or 2%. Don't get scared, please. Nobody is to become panicked. Because they have survived one cancer. Now here's Dr. Raza telling us you'll get a second one. No, I'm not saying that, but I am saying that there is a higher risk. And so those people, cancer survivors, it is in their best interest to have earliest diagnosis possible so we can prevent the appearance of the full clinical disease. And so I suggested to the think tank members that we should make Cancer Survivors Center, which exists already in practically every large institution, but they're not saving samples. I'm saying we should save saliva, fecal, and blood samples twice a year on these people. And so my whole think tank came together on this idea. And we are putting together, this means we will have maybe 10,000 samples in the tissue repository collected very quickly over the next 2-3 years. And out of those 10-20,000 samples, 300 will develop cancer in this time. Now we have their samples which we can study with the latest technology, but this all requires money. My idea is if we can find funding for the first 5 years to support this kind of an interconnected, interinstitutional first cell center for cancer survivors. Then after we show some success that we could now predict by studying these 200 who developed cancer, we can predict the next 200. Then cancer survivors will themselves want to give their samples, and because they'll know that early detection can save their lives. And so all I'm saying is, if even out of 16 million people, 1 million cancer survivors give us $10 a month for a year, that's $120 million for the centers. Imagine what we can do. And $10 a month is like going to Starbucks. That's it. On just 1 million cancer survivors, if they give it, we can get it done.
Great. Wow. I'll ask you this. Do you all have that mechanism of set up so that people can do that at this time?
Yes, the first cell center.
Yes.
At Columbia University. This is what we are doing now.
Dr. Raza, go ahead, and what is that web address? Where can people go to actually give to the First Cell Center? Was that .com, or tell us a little bit, where's that?
firstcellcenter.com or azraraza.com. You can go on my website and it gives you the place to donate. So I'm now putting together this whole, the whole mechanism for the multiple institutions to start sending us the cancer survivor samples. Right now, the First Cell Center has 60,000 samples from thousands of pre-leukemia and leukemia patients already. So we need to support studies on those samples, as well as all the other cancer survivors whose samples will be arriving now. Within the next 2 years, I plan to have thousands of cancer survivors samples, and until my last breath, I promise you that I will be working on this problem. And I think that this is the right path to go. Find cancer early in people who are susceptible. Once we know what the footsteps of earliest cancer are, then we start implantable devices that can be put under the skin at birth, which constantly monitor for the appearance of any disease problems. And I think this is the future, and it's a very exciting, very optimistic, very compassionate future.
Yeah, I'll tell you, it is a very exciting future. And I wanted to ask you, when are those scan blankets coming that I can put on a blanket at night and it scan my body? I heard you mention that before as well.
It's already in clinical trials. Instead of having, you go to sleep in bed sheets that scan you overnight for the appearance of hot areas that are getting more blood supply than normal, which is a tumor, beginning of a tumor. Or you could wear a smart bra that is fitted with 200 tactile sensors that you just have to wear for 1 hour a week, and it will detect the earliest sign of cancer. This is also in trial at Stanford University. So instead of having a mammogram once a year at best, you have constant weekly surveillance for the presence or appearance of cancer. So the idea is we should be monitoring the human body like a machine continuously, instead of monitoring it once a year or once every 5 years, like in colonoscopy. No, we need constant monitoring.
Dr. Raza, I want to thank you so much for having this virtual sit down with me. We're entering a new world, not only in our own personal lives due to this pandemic, due to this moment in time, but it sounds like, and I really hear it in your voice, that we are entering a new age of cancer research, cancer funding, and the way we look at cancer, diagnosing, prevention being the point where we start, not where we try to end at. Thank you so much. I want to affirm you. I like to do this with all of my guests. I want to affirm you in this. I did not know you prior to this journey that my family has been on, or have been on with my mother. I found you, and in finding you, I found a voice, not only for the medical community, but for people who have nowhere to go. I found you, and I'm grateful and I'm hopeful, because in hearing you today and in hearing you through, I would say, through podcasts and interviews, I can say that we have a direction to go, as my mother would say, forward. And so thank you so much for the work that you've done, for the work that you were doing, for for giving your life to something bigger than you and helping us all in the process. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erlina. And I will end with 2 lines from Emily Dickinson.
Yes.
I had no time to hate because the grave would hinder me. And life was not so ample I could finish enmity. Nor had I time to love. But since some industry must be, this little toil of love I thought was large enough for me.
Dr. Raza, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Okay.